Welcome, everyone. So let's get started. It's a pleasure to welcome you today to this lunchtime talk and conversation, I'll come back to that word shortly, by Milun Kothari on the subject of global displacement, why architects and planners should be very concerned. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mike Cooper. I'm an associate professor here in the school, and it's great to be able to introduce Milun and also serve as MC. And before getting started, I just want to say that Milun will be speaking for about half an hour, and then we'll open things up to questions and hopefully a conversation on the very important themes that he'll be introducing. And it goes without saying that it would be very hard, if not impossible, to find a speaker better suited to introduce and speak on the themes we'll be hearing about today. And Milun Kothari, our guest, is currently a visiting scholar in the program on human rights and justice at MIT, and a lecturer in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and an architect by training, so he felt immediately at home coming into the trays, and maybe slightly flashbacks, perhaps. Yeah.
Cold sweat.
Yeah, exactly. But very importantly, he served from 2000 to 2008 as Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing with the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and the Human Rights Council. So incredibly relevant position, again, to speak on these themes about human displacement. In recent years, Milun has been particularly active on topics such as women's right to land, inheritance and housing, housing and globalization, and the right to adequate housing. And this wealth of experience, it goes without saying, situates him incredibly well for the talk today. And so without further ado, I will turn the tables over to Milun. So take it away, please.
Thanks very much for the warm introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. So the topic today of global displacement, essentially a very depressing topic, but I'm going to try to make it more interesting in terms of what we can all do about this colossal crisis we face around the world. So the lecture is going to be in three parts. I'm going to just explain to you the scale of the displacement that we are confronting around the world. I'm going to look at some of the impacts of that and some of the responses from international bodies, academic institutions, and then we can have a discussion on how can we all collectively work more to support many groups around the world that are resisting displacement that is happening. So just to give you a context, so these are recent statistics from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which is the premier global body that collects information on displacement. These are largely focused on conflict and disasters. So you can see that the numbers in the last years have significantly increased, and particularly by conflict. So we're seeing a huge rise in people who are internally displaced within borders, but also across borders. The statistics on IDPs are particularly important for us as architects and planners, because recent studies show that about 50% of IDPs in the world today are living in urban areas, and that percentage is likely to increase in the coming years. So we have a situation where, in an already aggravated urban situation, where we have people who have been displaced within cities from development projects, but also people who come from the rural areas, we also have an influx of IDPs, and the huge difficulty of separating people who have been displaced for different reasons, and I'll just come to that. So one of the projects that we have been involved in with, when I say we, I'm talking about, I should also introduce the MIT Displacement Research Action Network, which is a recent initiative to try to bring together academics, civil society groups, UN institutions and governments in a global alliance to gather evidence and to tackle the displacement crisis. So DRAN and IDMC have recently released, just a few weeks ago, a major new report on urban IDPs, where we collected information from cities around the world, looking at whether there are good examples of the integration of IDPs into the urban space. Now, what is important here with this collaboration is that IDMC, which is traditionally a humanitarian group, reached out to MIT DRAN precisely because they realized that in dealing with urban IDPs, you need to understand cities, you need to understand area planning, you need to understand how to work with municipalities, you need to understand what to do with host communities. So this report is a major breakthrough in a way, in many senses. One, of course, the most important is that we are confronting the global humanitarian community, which is the High Commissioner for Refugees, ICRC, International Organization of Migration, to say that they have to move beyond just humanitarian standards and look at human rights standards. They have to look much more at urban planning issues. So in that sense, it's a beginning, but I just wanted to mention that to you about the urban IDPs. And if you look at refugees, again, you can see the numbers that are growing. So when you put it all together, we're talking about millions of people around the world who are currently in a post-displacement, post-conflict situation, and many of these, I don't have the exact figures, but millions of these people are what humanitarian groups call in a state of protracted displacement. So essentially, their lives, whether in the camps in the rural areas or in urban slums and so on, have not been resolved in terms of their housing and living conditions improving, and some of them are living in these conditions for decades. Very often, these are the people that are not on our radar. Unfortunately, very often these are the people who are not even you don't even find them in master plans. It's sort of assumed that they'll go away somewhere, which of course they don't. And of course, the other concern right now is, and this may be partly related to climate change, but in the last 3-4 years, we've also seen a significant rise in the number of people being displaced by disasters. Now, while we have these statistics on displacement and disasters, what we don't have are comparable data on development-based displacement. So when I speak about development-based displacement, I'm essentially talking about slum clearance drives, large-scale infrastructure, land acquisition measures associated with urban renewal, housing renovation, city beautification. We know the gentrification going on here in the US. Land use programs. There's an incredible increase in land grabbing across Africa right now, but not only limited to Africa. And then, of course, evictions are also on the rise because of the reluctance of states, and I'll come back to this, to control speculation in housing and property. And this is a major sort of stumbling block that we face, that while there's a lot of talk about providing affordable housing, it's more of a sort of a band-aid type of solution. That there is very little preventative work going on to actually stop gentrification and the sort of unbridled rise in property prices. So that's a so when we look at all these types of development-based evictions, it's very difficult to get global figures. When I was Special Rapporteur in 2004, we had done a very sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation, and at that point we figured out that actually in 2004 or 2003, more people were displaced from so-called development projects, urban and rural, than because of armed and ethnic conflict, which was a major finding in a way. It wasn't very scientific, but that's the calculation we had. Because if you look at single projects. You looked at Three Gorges Dam in China, you looked at dams in India and parts of Latin America. Single projects were displacing 300, 400,000 people. And the same can be said of infrastructure projects in cities. In India, some scholarly work that has been done actually shows that since 1947, since our independence, about 60 million people have been displaced in the country from development projects. So that's 1 million a year, right? And of course, numbers are sometimes difficult to comprehend. But what we have seen is that that disproportionately the people who are evicted from these so-called development projects are the poorest. They're the socially and economically most vulnerable and marginalized. Disproportionately, people who are evicted are those who have been historically discriminated, indigenous people and others. Disproportionate in the context of the number of people within the population. And of course, displacement, that type of displacement that we've been seeing and which has been increasing, it intensifies inequality. It leads to social conflict, and it contributes, I think most importantly from a planning perspective, we have to look at, it actually directly contributes to segregation and ghettoization in cities, and the increase of what I'm calling apartheid cities. And I'm going to show you one such example from my own country, from New Delhi. And when we look at, again, the sort of human rights perspective is very important in understanding, analyzing these impacts, because when we disaggregate and when we look at who is affected and what are the impacts, one of the clearest groups that is affected, in terms of both psychological and material impacts, are women. What's interesting in this is that while I was talking about the disproportionate effect on particular groups, what we found that wherever evictions take place, discrimination plays a very critical role in forced evictions cases. So ethnic, religious, racial and other minorities, as I mentioned, as well as indigenous tribal people, are far more likely than others to be evicted. But women suffer particularly as a result of forced evictions. And as a consequence, not only loss of the home, but also livelihoods, relationships, support systems, breakdown of kinship ties, physical and psychological trauma, and studies show that even increased morbidity and mortality. And a very serious consequence is the fact that evictions increase the vulnerability of women to further acts of violence. I'll just give you an example. There's an excellent recent study done by Professor Matthew Desmond here at Harvard, working with the MacArthur Foundation, who looked at the situation of black women in Milwaukee, and the study says that in Milwaukee there are 105,000 renter households. Landlords evict roughly 16,000 adults and children from 6,000 units each year. That's 16 households evicted per day. And in the disadvantaged neighborhoods, what he points out in the study is that evictions is to women what incarceration is to men, in the sense that incarceration locks men up while evictions lock women out. So the study shows that women from black neighborhoods in Milwaukee represented only 9.6% of the population, but 30% of the evictions. So it was just to illustrate. Other studies have shown the very serious impact on children. That obviously it leads to damaging the child's school performance. Its increased residential mobility has been associated with linked to higher rates of adolescent violence. Evictions often push, as we've seen with the demolition of public housing in the US, families deeper into a slum, relocating them in an even more high-density situation in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And of course, so with neighborhoods that have a detrimental impact on the child's health, development, and well-being. So there is a, so these are just, I'm just looking at women and children, but we can, there are many similar studies of groups around the world. Some of the recent studies that have been done, there's something called an eviction impact assessment tool that was developed by the Housing and Land Rights Network. And that has been used, and we've seen in the studies that have been done with this impact assessment tool that in one place in Baljeet Nagar in Delhi, that overall it was found that the slum that was, part of the slum that was evicted, the average family who lost a home suffered at a minimum loss of access, obviously, to housing and shelter, including loss of documentation. So a lot of information that identified them, including IDs that showed that they actually had tenure security. Significant reductions in access to livelihood activities. When you're displaced, you lose access to your jobs and wages. Substantial reduction in monthly spending on food, because whatever money you have, you tend to spend on rent wherever you can get, or health needs and so on. Substantial increase in expenses incurred in accessing water, because you have to buy water. Substantial increase in injuries, so it's increased expenses in costs, in costs related to health, loss of education for children, and the destruction of numerous assets and possessions. And a number of other studies that have been done, similar studies in Nairobi, Kenya, in Cairo, show similar results. Faced with this type of a situation where we now at least know, and we have known for the last 2 decades, the significant damage that comes from displacement, what has been the response? It's really interesting to look at. What has been the response of the United Nations? What has been the response of governments? What has been the response of academic institutions, if any? And I'll just give you a few minutes on how the UN has responded. Obviously, the information about these types of evictions and their impacts have been coming to the UN, at least I remember, since the early 90s. And in 1993, the UN Commission on Human Rights, which is the highest, at that time was the highest intergovernmental body working on human rights in the UN, actually adopted what at that time was considered, and still is, a historic resolution unanimously called forced evictions, where they recognize that forced evictions are a gross violation of human rights. And they also recognize that they affect what I was quoting before, the poorest and the most marginalized. Subsequent to that, there was attention from different UN bodies, and when I took over as rapporteur in 2000, it wasn't very difficult for me to realize, I've done work on displacement before, that the most pervasive violation of the right to housing, which is what I was supposed to be globally protecting, were forced evictions. And when I looked around at the standards that existed globally, there was, of course, work done by the World Bank, there was work done by some UN bodies, but I found that there actually wasn't a single operational standard or instrument that you could hand over to a municipality and say, okay, this is what you need to do before, during, and after displacement to safeguard people's human rights. So in 2004, we began a 3-year process of drafting these standards, which were, we looked at best practices from around the world in terms of national laws and policies. We looked at alternatives that were being proposed by some society groups. And we had many regional consultations, expert meetings, and so the result of all that was that in 2007, we presented to the Human Rights Council something called the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on Development-Based Displacement and Evictions. And these are now the current sort of globally accepted operational guidelines. And in these guidelines, we essentially had sort of 2-3 points of departure. One is, of course, we said that you cannot take a position that there should be no evictions, because there are, thousands of people, millions who are living in health and life-threatening conditions, and they would have to be moved. But we said it can only happen in exceptional circumstances, and there's in the guidelines. If you see them, there's a list of what that means. And the guidelines also focused on quite a lot on prevention measures, that before displacement takes place, you have to explore alternatives. As we've seen, I would say some of the studies done have shown that about 80% of the displacement that takes place can be avoided. So the onus is on the authorities to demonstrate that they've looked at alternatives. We also put in a provision that just like we have environmental impact assessments, we should also have eviction impact assessments, what are sometimes called social impact assessments, before people are evicted. And the idea there, of course, was that, and then there's a whole section on prior pre-informed consent from the communities, public hearings, and the guidelines also create a sort of a new right, in the sense of the right to resettle, that people have a right to resettle if they're living in dangerous conditions, and there's a range of, so it's a very detailed set of standards that are now being used. They're being translated in 20 languages. They've been used in several, at least 5 court cases around the world. They're being used in training of officials. They're slowly becoming more known. But of course that's not enough, and much more needs to be done. But it was just to mention, and subsequent to that, to my mandate, the rapporteurs that have come after me, both on housing and on UN special rapporteurs on internally displaced people, on extreme poverty, violence against women, on the right to food. The previous special rapporteur on the right to food, Olivier de Schutter from Belgium, has done some incredible work on evictions that happen because of food systems, land grabbing that takes place, so that work is ongoing at the UN. But what I wanted to focus on today is one response from an academic institution, which is the work we're doing at the Displacement Research Action Network, because we've been able to recently do some very intensive work on one of the sort of aspects that has been troubling all those people who've been working on development-based displacement, is what actually happens to the people who are displaced. Where do they go? We know that for conflict and disaster. We don't know what happens to someone who's displaced from a river beautification project in the city, or someone who's displaced from a large dam somewhere. Where do they go? Where do they end up? What are the human rights impacts that they have to face? And also, very critically, from a sort of planning perspective, what happens to the spaces that they leave behind? So in a city, is there a change in the morphology of the city? Is there some sort of a design that is there? Why is it that people are being evicted? So these are some of the questions we wanted to answer, and that's not, it's not easy to do, but we're trying to make progress, and I wanted to share this with all of you today and see what you think. And I know that there's some similar efforts here as well. Vinit is here, the work they're doing in Mumbai, and it would be great to relate more to that. So I'm just going to run you through some of the work we are doing at RAN. So I mentioned why the network was set up, and we these are some of the goals of the network, of course looking at tools and technologies, but essentially trying to develop better collaboration and produce more evidence on displacement. And we have as collaborating institutions several UN agencies, we have several large civil society organizations, ESCR-Net, Housing Land Rights Network, and now we're also working with IDMC, and we've had several major conferences working with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I think some of you have been attending these. The most recent one was we brought together 25 people from around the world, activists and academics who are working on developing strategies against evictions and displacement. We had a conference the year before looking at, because one of the areas we're focusing on is the right to land, so property from below. And we're continuing with the work. I'll speak a bit more about that. There are also several courses that are being taught at Department of Urban Studies and Planning, including one called Planning Against Eviction and Displacement this semester. And last semester we had a course on housing and land rights for planners, which looked at ethics and human rights for planners. And actually there were 4 or 5 GST students there as well. And then of course we're developing these mapping technologies. So methodologies. So I want to talk about some of the work we did last year. We took 8 masters and PhD students to Delhi for a month in August last year to look at what has happened in the city, essentially map displacement over the last 15 years or so. I just want to give you a quick context on Delhi for those of you who don't know. It is of course a mega city, most rapidly urbanizing in India, and around 1 to 3 million, this is a conservative figure, people live in what are called Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, so informal settlements in Delhi. Delhi is a very complex city because there are multiplicity of landowning agencies. There's the central government is also there. So there's the whole abuse of what is called public interest, which is used to evict people. And there's of course, a large part of the land is owned by the government. So essentially, fighting evictions should be easy, but it hasn't been. The primary approach of the government until very recently, there's some dramatic developments recently where the current state government has said there should be no more demolitions. So until recently, the approach has been to evict residents from around the city, but particularly from one part of the city, which I'll show you, and put them in what has now become a ring of resettlement sites around the city. We've had a sort of spike in evictions around 2006 to 2010 when we had the mega sporting event, Commonwealth Games, in the city. So this is what we were doing. We worked with local partners. This initiative was part of a practicum course at MIT where students have to go out and work somewhere for a month and actually contribute produce something that will be used as advocacy for local groups. So we worked with think tanks, academic institutions, NGOs in Delhi. And essentially, we were looking at who are the people living in the Jhuggi Jhopri clusters, what are their conditions, what happens when they're evicted, very important, who gets to make the decision when they're evicted, who gets to make the decision where they're resettled, and what, if any, services they get when they're resettled. And essentially, if that was not to happen, and if there was a halt to evictions, what would an inclusive Delhi look like? So the students mapped who are the main actors, how do they work with each other, how do they work with institutions. The courts, of course, are very important in India. We've had some very, very progressive, but also some regressive judgments on evictions. So we did a mapping of that. We looked at, we developed a common web portal that the groups can use to upload information. I'll just run you through that. And so these are some maps that show where the evictions took place from 1999 to, so essentially, oh, sorry. this is the Yamuna River in Delhi. This is North Delhi. This is South. Essentially, what we can call the sort of elite part of the city is here and here, which is some of you may know, the Lutyens, Delhi, British time, the diplomatic enclave, and a number of other what we call posh colonies in Delhi. So this just shows where the evictions happened in this period. These were the evictions that preceded the Commonwealth Games. So one of the largest evictions in the history of Delhi from a place called Yamuna Pushta took place, the community living along the river in 4 years before the Commonwealth Games, and a number of other areas around here. I'll show you a video of the and we can see that the idea, what happened essentially was that people who were evicted were concentrated into peripheral zones around the city, some about 40 kilometers away. And these are some of the evictions that happened after 2010. So you can see the evictions happening where and of course the size is larger the circle, the larger the settlement.
Can we ask questions along the way here?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
A few years ago with Rahul, we went to Mumbai where we were studying the Cup Parade, and
Right.
I'm familiar with the tenure system. I assume are these what we were calling the slum areas in Bombay, or are these different from what would be considered the slums?
No, they're different. We have, in Delhi, there are 6 categories. We have authorized slums, unauthorized slums, PWD clusters. So these are largely, essentially, some are what we call notified slums, but most of them are informal settlements where people did not have security or tenure, although some of them were there for a very long time. So it's a different category that comes under there's no law governing that, while you have laws like in Mumbai governing slum settlements.
Right. I guess, because I unfortunately have to leave shortly,
Okay.
I was curious to find what you recommend. You spent, understanding the dimensions of the problem are wonderful, but given, I see the concentration in the central areas where you really do want to have a mechanism for redevelopment, and
Right.
that, especially where the areas are very overcrowded and can't under any feasible solution accommodate everybody there, plus also accommodate enough new development to pay for the social housing.
Right.
What do you recommend?
Can you stay 10 more minutes? Because I'll just kind of come to.
I would unfortunately have to leave
Okay.
at 5, so I can say 5.
You're preempting my. No, I'm just. No, essentially, where we are in Delhi right now is at least theoretically a very fortunate position, because the recent government that just recently came to power has essentially made an announcement that there will be no more demolitions in Delhi. And they've even got the railway authorities and other landowning agencies.
But I don't see that necessarily as a good thing, because to the extent that stops new investment and development in its tracks, or tremendously raises the cost, that may be protecting one group at the expense of society.
Well, I don't want to be provocative, but that's a very U.S.-based position. I think in India, at least in the cities I know in the south, in fact, what we've been able to show with these maps for the first time, what we knew all along while we were working there, is that 90% of the evictions that took place were not necessary. And in fact, the areas of the city that were cleared, which is central, south, southwest Delhi, a study that we did for the Housing and Land Rights Network, actually in 20 primary sites that were evicted for the Commonwealth Games. And the excuse the government gave was, we are doing this because we need the land for infrastructure, we need it for new stadiums. 19 of those sites are empty. There are parking lots, nothing is happening. So it's very clear in cities like Delhi, it's very clear, I can name you 20 cities around the world, where the evictions are happening not because they're necessary by any stretch of the imagination. They're happening because there's a clear design for the state to eradicate poor people from certain parts of the city. Right? So not to have poor people in certain areas. So when you look at it from that type of a context, it's not a question of we need investment, we need infrastructure. And what we're also able to show with these maps, which I'm going to come to briefly, is that if for the remaining Jhuggi-Jhopri clusters that are there, if you draw just a 2-kilometer, 3-kilometer radius around the existing, because many of the settlements are small, right? If you do that, it's very possible to provide civic services to all of them and to create vibrant communities and to do what we're always saying in planning, mixed-use housing, and to have a vibrant city. And the other situation, which you may not be aware, where you've seen it in Bombay, it's all the labor comes from these areas. Right? So does it really make sense, like we see happening in Boston now, people have to be bussed in from, does it make sense to have that kind of urban development that you have to? So there's sort of different sociological and political, historical issues as well of how you handle. What's happening in cities like Delhi is, again, what's happening around the world, that there's this big, it's exactly what you were saying, there's this obsession that the government has with building a world-class city, getting global investment, clearing areas of undesirable people, so, foreigners who come don't have to see the slums. So it's a very different kind of a trajectory. It's not justified by any kind of, logic of real estate development. From a rights perspective, you can take a different perspective if you want, but.
Well, I guess where I was coming from was looking at Dharavi as sort of
Right.
the slum I know best, where it's just tremendously overpopulated to accommodate any kind of workable redevelopment in the sense of not displacing everybody, but trying to provide basic services and decent housing.
But the evicting those people is not the answer. Maybe
no,
you need a different.
No, I'm not suggesting it is the answer, but and of course Dharavi, I realize, is lots of people do have land tenure rights, but then there's also lots of people who don't.
And they have livelihood. There's a lot of.
But if you're ever going to fix the, that's
Okay.
another conversation. Sorry.
Okay, so that was, and if you look at this, it'll show you actually where the
So I guess what I was hoping you would at least give me an opinion on is on those areas that you do want development, not as opposed to those where it should never have happened, the displacement should never have happened. What do you recommend in those situations where you're trying to bring in the infrastructure and you're trying to provide housing and services to the population?
well, global standards, even Indian constitutional provisions are very clear on that. First of all, we would recommend you talk to the people.
Oh, sure.
You find out from people what do they want, what are the alternatives that are available. If we have a fantastic judgment from the Delhi High Court in India called the Sudama Singh judgment. It's actually the right of way judgment, which says whoever the government says is in the right of way of infrastructure, what is the process you have to follow if those people have to be displaced? And essentially, so that's what we would recommend. That would be a good beginning. People reconciling, which is beginning to happen now. But so what this was showing you was, as the years progress, how. Do you want me to run it again? Did everybody? So it's showing you how at the beginning the displacement was essentially people were moved fairly close to where they were living before. And as the years progressed, you see the yellow, the resettlement colonies began to go farther and farther, some 40 to 45 kilometers away, which essentially meant people lost their livelihood, essentially meant that there was actually, directly as a result of that, there was an increase in homelessness in Delhi because a lot of people came back because that's where their work was. And so now we have a situation where you have actually a ring of resettlement sites. And this is not unique to Delhi. It's also happened in Chennai, in South India, it's happened in Mumbai. So that is the model that has been followed. So you can see here, in the 60s it's closer, and then the radius gets farther and farther as the years progressed. And then of course we looked at how much time do we have? I'm sorry.
I think a couple of minutes, but it'd be great to maybe.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. To look at this issue which we were just discussing with the gentleman who just left, who has the authority to displace? What are the role of different landowning and other administrative agencies? Who collects the information? In fact, there's quite a lot of transparency on data in India, and what you don't have, you can get through a very robust right to information law. But it's still, so the data doesn't really sometimes match, and that was one of the difficulties the students had, is to try to match all the different information that is available, and of course the role of the participation of communities. So these are all the different landowning agencies. I'll just quickly rush through this in Delhi. So it's quite a mess actually. And then we looked at, so what would an inclusive Delhi look like for the people who are left? And this is the work that was done to show that if you did a radius around the areas where most of the remaining clusters are, it actually should be not difficult at all to provide people common service points, common civic services access to education and so on. And then there's as I mentioned, we created this online portal that can be used by the network of groups who are working together in Delhi, most of them, where people could upload information. They could even put up information on evictions that are threatened, and you could have a situation where you can sort of zero in on a particular neighborhood, and you'll be able to find photographs, videos, fact-finding reports, public tribunal reports, and so on about that area, and it would become a common point of action. You would also be able to put up publications on strategies of how people have avoided displacement and what has happened. So these are some of the next steps for our work at DRAN. I also had some maps from some of our partners, but I won't run into that. Let me just sort of conclude with some general remarks. So it's very clear when you look at an example of a city like Delhi, or if you think about what I was saying about the global impacts, that we need to move towards a much more radical rural and urban agenda that actually is revolved around protecting people from being displaced. Where one of the more promising sort of work that's being done globally now in terms of global platforms is on the right to the city, and I find that as a very useful, sort of as a central pillar for the planning profession and what I've been calling an organizing principle of urban and regional planning. If we could work on that, where we could look at the range of issues around protecting the most vulnerable about affordability, controlling land and property speculation, ultimately rethinking economic policies. And whatever we are doing, aligning ourselves with those that are resisting evictions, using our skills as architects and planners to be part of that resistance. And let me end on a sort of a poignant but very realistic note that actually what we are facing with this type of phenomenon is an understanding right now amongst, sort of a silent understanding amongst policymakers that that people are dispensable, that people have to be displaced. If countries are to progress, if countries are to become, cities are to become world-class cities, and this is perhaps the most insidious and debilitating notion of the current neoliberal agenda. And so whatever we are doing, it's a fight and a struggle against that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I'd love to open things up to, I have loads and loads of questions, but I don't want to also dominate things. So I'd love instead to hear from you. Any questions for comments? Maybe here and then Beneath.
My name is Sohan. I have a question because the same situation that you show in Delhi regarding the Commonwealth Games, it's happening now in Rio due to the Olympics. Do you know if there is a kind of a systematic movement to use this kind of global games with a kind of hidden purpose of evicting people from premium areas in the city?
Yeah, actually, the Grand Network itself is that's one of the next cities we are going to be working on. We're working with FASE, and police and other groups who are also working with the grassroots organizations that are resisting the evictions in the build-up to the Olympics now, to try to do a similar kind of exercise, to actually map what has happened in Rio over the last 15 years. And of course you would know, but we suspect that the reasons why some of the favelas are being evicted has nothing to do with the Olympics. And so, but that needs to be demonstrated. And I think what's powerful about this type of work is that we can write as many articles as possible, we can give speeches, but if you're able to sort of visually depict, and that's where we come in as planners and so on. So that work is just beginning to happen now in Rio. And also I should mention, I was going to show you another map, but also in Istanbul. There's some really dangerous things that are happening in Istanbul. There's a new law now which actually makes it possible for the government to evict anybody anywhere in Istanbul with the excuse that they're living on an earthquake-prone area. So it's another long line of excuses to get rid of people from particular parts of the city.
I thought Rick's question was so interesting, the fellow who left. And you were sort of talking about this idea that evictions are absolutely inevitable or necessary, but it's so interesting, it kind of comes down to a conceptual idea of the city about sort of what is the real city, which I think is so interesting but slightly disturbing, that there's a sort of legitimate city and there's an illegitimate city, and certain eggs have to be broken to make the legitimate component bigger. But interestingly, even from an economic argument, the idea that the informal is somehow is such a strange leap that people make, that because something's informal, that is not actually a big part or even the major part of the economy of the city. So I think it's just such an interesting sort of reasoning to come, well, this is informal, therefore it must be detracting from the economic dimension of the city. I think is so interesting because it's probably certainly not true and maybe demonstrably false. I'm really glad the Commonwealth game evictions are over, because the head of that effort on the Commonwealth side was a guy called Michael Hooper, which gave me some troublesome emails for a couple of years. Beneath?
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to this side of Cambridge. These conversations don't happen that often here. But one question for you. Professor Hooper is part of the ones that do allow for this to happen. I'm going to caveat, but one question for you is that a lot of us as students who are entering the planning, architecture, design professions, we're trained to draw quite well and to use drawings as a way of making things visible. And one of the things you've shown with your students has been that those tools can be used to bring about patterns that are usually invisible, discredited. The conversation earlier with economic arguments for urban development kind of would have those stay invisible or not acknowledge them when they are. And one question for you is, with this visual material, the maps, visual documentation, what actors do you see grabbing onto it? How do you see the kind of machine of making visual, legible information, arguments, narratives, which can be absorbed easily, working out? If there was a dream scenario where the GSD and MIT were reshaped into machines for producing a cadre of professionals who could do that quite effectively, what would happen in 10 years? What would we be doing? And I ask that quite selfishly, as you know, maybe that's possible. Maybe that's possible, and I mean, it can be a way for us to reappropriating other arguments that are made by visual materials that will be used by builders, developers, development agencies, which will abstract and commodify space and people and land into 225 square feet, 400 square feet, PAP. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I was hoping you would speak a few minutes about your work in Mumbai as well, but perhaps afterwards. One of the slides I was going to show actually was a slide on the limitations of mapping. And I think we need to be conscious of that it's not, this by itself is not a solution. It just contributes to, so let me speak, just based on the example that I was giving. So the groups in Delhi are now, we're going to hand over all this material to them, and they're going to use it as part of their advocacy to say no more evictions, and to essentially say that we should shift to a policy of upgradation, right? And I think the visual material, which has been very welcomed by the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, which is the main body working on these issues in Delhi, and a number of the groups working on these issues, it becomes a very useful advocacy tool. It's also very useful, as we found in some other work in some other cities with the media, to actually show people what's happening, to the city, and if you have video and other material, that's very helpful as well. I think that your dream scenario is definitely worth dreaming about. I think what is really required, and when we work with the students, in a sense it was somewhat easier at MIT because many of the students come from a social science background. So I think it's really important to bring in, as I was explaining to you when I was talking about the impacts, to bring in the sociological dimensions, to bring in, different sort of impacts that happen, and to really understand if we are designing in an urban context, who are the people, where do they come from, what do they do, how do they survive, how do they relate to each other. We are very preoccupied with how one building relates to the other one, but not as much about, so I think it's really a question of completely rethinking curricula. It's a question not only of doing this kind of mapping, but essentially trying to conceptualize and understand in a very deep sense the city in a very different way. But I would be delighted if we had, imagine if we had 20 cities that were studied, not only like this, but even better, including the methodologies you're using in Mumbai. I think it would be a tremendous resource. It would also be a resource, as we found with the work on disaster and conflict for the UN agencies. One of the maps I was going to show is UNOSAT's work in Syria, for example, right now. And they've been able to show through satellite mapping exactly what is happening with the resettlement camps, where the people are moving. And that's incredibly useful for humanitarian agencies. It's sort of a day-to-day kind of a thing. So if we could provide that kind of visual material on development-based, we could not only show the damage, but we could actually show where is it that people are moving, where they need help, or where there's a need for planning people to move, right? Because right now people don't know, and most people, what I find very disturbing, most planners, architects do that. It's sort of it's like walking by a homeless person. You essentially walk by people who have been displaced. You sort of think, well, someone else is handling that problem. It's not my problem. And what I'd like to really stress, and I think we're all trying to do that, Michael, several other people, Professor Bala, practitioner in MIT, is to get to the students that you really need to care, and you really need to, like you say, offer the tremendous skills that you have. I mean, some of the MIT students we took to Delhi, their skills were very, very useful. They didn't realize that themselves until they got in there and said, oh yeah, we can do this and we can do that, and we can work with local groups. So there's a huge agenda out there, and we need to do much more of this.
The advocacy component is so important as well. Going back to this sort of idea of legitimacy,
Right.
it's interesting, in Dar es Salaam we were looking at renters.
Mhm.
And in some way, we found these disturbing results that city officials and international organizations just didn't take renters seriously very much in the way they were most easily evicted, they were displaced far from the city. But maybe even more distressing, you sort of maybe expect that of developers and city planners and international investors, but renters themselves
Right.
didn't take themselves seriously. And you can imagine that's very true of all sorts of renterhood and residents of informal, lots of those people are in some sense renters, and that idea that you almost have to build the sense that they themselves merit inclusion in the city. I mean, and so the advocacy component I think is also really big, and you've been doing such great work there.
Well, that's a really important point, because the other use of material like this, particularly if the communities are themselves involved, so if we're looking at alternatives, we're looking at different plans, it's very empowering for people to know where they are, what's happening, that if you show a community and say, look, you actually don't need to be displaced. You have to fight for your rights to stay where you are, because if you are displaced, this is what's going to happen to you. I mean, and the great thing about visual literacy is that it actually really does get across to people. I mean, you can read a 50-page document, but if you see the kind of graphs that IDMC produces or even XCR produces, it's like immediately you see what is happening. And if we can, develop methodologies of simple graphics, and movement is really important. And a lot of people have been like, oh, how did you do that? How did you show that? But it wasn't difficult, right? But if you can show that dynamic of what is happening, because our cities are in constant flux. We're not living in any kind of static situation where you say, okay, everybody's going to be where they are for the next 10 years. Look at Boston. I mean, so if you can show that, and if you can show a historical dimension to it, that there's actually a pattern that's been developing, the way in which cities are run. As planners, we should know that. So the case study method, this practicums, I think all of that is integrated in some of what we're doing in our studios as well.
Do we have other questions? Please, John.
Related to historical dimension a little bit, I apologize for missing the majority of the talk, but I'm curious about some of because this process has been going on for so long, what percentage of the people that are being evicted or displaced in the past 10 years are actually the same population as were being displaced in the 60s, or is there like a sort of second generation of displacement that's taking place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, that's one of the things we're trying to find out, because it's not so easy. A lot of people do move back to where they came from, or as we're seeing in the recent studies in India, which actually show that the migration now is happening, either between cities or from villages to smaller cities or medium-sized cities, not so much to the mega cities. There is a constant sort of movement, and that's what we would be able to track if we develop better methodologies to track where people are moving. But I can tell you from Delhi's experience that a large part of the population is the same. In fact, when we do interviews with people who are evicted, one of the most moving comments that I've heard was one person saying that, you know, it took us 20 years to get to where we are, so that our children are in school, they're going to college, and if you move us 40 kilometers away, we're going to have to start from scratch. Right? So these are people who've been there for a long time. And so people, and we have these horrendous situations where people who have been, I mean, you can see it from the pavement dwellers in Mumbai, you can see some of the homeless people in Delhi. People have been there for decades, but it's not, so quite a large percentage of the population is the same. But there is a very important sociological element in what you're saying also, because of people move on, right, or they move up, and you know, they do slowly improve their lives, and then they're no longer part of this group of people, right? But then others take their place. And the other factor which I find is very understudied in terms of sort of the growth of cities is the natural growth. You know, very often people get fixated on migration and people coming in, but there's a huge percentage of the mega city increase people who are already there, and you know, their families and their and so we don't know what happens to them. How do they, you know, if someone has 6 children, what happened to them when they grew up? You know? So essentially, what is really lacking is is that type of work. And I'm very often very jealous of people who work on conflict and disaster, because the database that they have is fantastic. But why can we not have a similar database? It's more challenging. You know, one of the things we're looking at now is, so okay, you want to track people who are displaced by development. How do you do it? Do you use cell phone technology? You know, how do you actually track? What are the privacy issues there? I mean, this is some of the work we're doing with our Center for Civic Media at MIT. We're trying to develop that, but we need to sort of dive into this and see what can be done, at least so that we have a better sense of where we are.
Any other questions? Well, maybe that's a good spur for us to have some brownies and coffee and chat about this more informally. So thank you very much, Milind.